The moment he touched me, the entire room stopped breathing. The tray in my hands felt heavier than it should have, like the weight of every watching I had settled onto my wrists. Crystal glasses trembled softly as I moved through the ballroom. Careful, invisible, exactly what I was supposed to be. The Voss Foundation Gala wasn't a place for people like me to exist beyond the edges. Gold light poured from chandeliers the size of small cars, reflecting off polished marble floors that probably cost more than my yearly rent. Men in tailored suits spoke in low, confident tones. Women in silk gowns laughed like nothing in the world could ever touch them. And then there was him. Adrian Voss stood near the far end of the room, not speaking, not smiling, just watching. He didn't need to move to be noticed. The crowd bent around him like gravity had shifted in his favor. I had heard his name before tonight, always in lowered voices, always followed by silence. But nothing prepared me for the way he looked in person. Calm, controlled, dangerous in a way that didn't need to prove itself. I lowered my gaze and kept walking. Waitresses didn't stare at men like him. We served, we nodded, we disappeared. That was the rule. That was how you stayed safe. Champagne? I asked softly, stopping beside a group of guests near the terrace doors. My voice sounded steady, even though something in the air felt wrong. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was quieter than that. A tension that hummed just beneath the surface, like a storm waiting for permission. One of the men barely glanced at me as he took a glass. The other didn't take one at all. He just kept talking, his voice low, clipped, urgent. I shouldn't have listened. I knew better. But something in his tone pulled at my attention, just for a second too long. Tonight, he said. It has to happen tonight. My fingers tightened slightly around the tray. I shifted my weight, trying to step away, trying to pretend I hadn't heard anything at all. That's when it happened. My elbow brushed against another server passing behind me. The tray tilted, just slightly. One glass slid out of place. I caught it before it fell, but not before a few drops of champagne spilled over the rim. The pale liquid splashed onto the back of my hand, cold against my skin. Careful, someone murmured nearby. I nodded quickly, forcing a small apology as I steadied the tray. My heart was beating faster now, for reasons I couldn't explain. I turned to leave, to get back to the safety of movement, of being unseen. And then I felt it. Not a touch. Not yet. Just awareness. Like a spotlight had shifted directly onto me. I looked up without meaning to. Across the room, Adrian Voss was no longer watching the crowd. He was watching me. Not casually. Not by accident. Directly. Intentionally. His gaze didn't move when I froze. It didn't soften or sharpen. It simply held me there, like I had stepped into something I couldn't step out of. I swallowed, forcing my feet to move again. One step, then another. I told myself it meant nothing. That I was just another face in a crowded room. That powerful men looked at people all the time without remembering them seconds later. But something in my chest refused to believe that. Because he didn't look away. And somehow, without a word, I knew this night had already gone wrong. I told myself to keep moving, but my steps slowed without permission, like my body was listening to something my mind could not hear yet. The tray was steady again, but my pulse was not, each beat louder than the soft music drifting through the ballroom. I should not have looked back, but I did, just once, just long enough to confirm what I already knew. Adrian Voss was still watching me, and nothing in his expression had changed. No curiosity, no amusement, no distraction, just that same quiet focus that made my skin feel too tight. I turned away quickly and headed toward the service corridor, where the lighting dimmed and the noise softened into something manageable. This was where I belonged, in the in-between spaces, where people like me could breathe again. The double doors swung shut behind me with a muted click, cutting off the glittering world like it had never existed. I exhaled slowly, setting the tray down on a stainless steel counter that reflected my face back at me in warped fragments. "You are fine," I whispered to myself, barely louder than a breath. "You are overthinking this. Rich men look at people. That is all this is." But the words felt thin, like they could not hold up against something heavier pressing in from the edges. One of the other servers, a woman named Claire, brushed past me with a stack of empty glasses. "You look like you saw a ghost," she said lightly, not slowing down. I forced a small smile that did not reach my eyes. "Just tired," I said. "Long shift." She nodded like she believed me. Or maybe she just did not care enough to question it. That was the thing about this job. Everyone kept their distance, even from each other. It made everything easier. I picked up another tray, this one filled with fresh drinks, and turned back toward the ballroom. The moment the doors opened again, the sound rushed in. Laughter, music, the soft clink of glass against glass. Everything looked exactly the same. Perfect. Untouched. But the feeling in my chest had not settled. It followed me as I stepped back onto the floor, as if I had carried something unseen with me. I kept my eyes down this time, focusing on the rhythm of the work. Step, offer, nod, move. Simple, predictable, safe, until it was not. A hand closed gently but firmly around my wrist before I could pass the center of the room. I froze, the tray tilting just slightly before I caught it again. The touch was not rough, but it was absolute. Not a request, not a question, a decision. I did not need to look up to know who it was. The room around us seemed to quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the music stopping. Conversation slowed, then faded, like people were realizing something important was happening without understanding why. I lifted my gaze slowly, my breath catching somewhere between my lungs and my throat. Adrian Voss stood close enough that I could see the fine detail of his expression now, the calm precision in his eyes, the way nothing about him seemed rushed or uncertain. Up close, he felt even more controlled, like every movement had already been decided long before it happened. "You should not be here," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. The words did not sound like a warning. They sounded like a fact. I swallowed, my mind scrambling to catch up. "I work here," I managed, my voice softer than I intended. For a second, nothing changed. His gaze did not shift, his grip did not loosen. Then something flickered in his eyes, not surprise, not doubt, something closer to calculation. "No," he said after a pause, almost to himself. "Not like this." Before I could respond, before I could even fully understand what he meant, his hand moved from my wrist to the tray, steadying it with one smooth motion. Another step brought him closer, close enough that the space between us disappeared entirely. "Stay where you are," he murmured, his voice still calm, still controlled, but carrying something that made it impossible to ignore. My heart stuttered, my instincts screaming at me to step back, to pull away, to leave. But my feet did not move. Because somehow, in the middle of a crowded room filled with powerful people, it felt like the only thing more dangerous than staying was trying to walk away. My fingers tightened around the tray as his words settled into my bones, not loud, not sharp, but impossible to ignore, like a quiet command my body understood before my mind did. I should have stepped back, should have pulled away from him, should have reminded myself that I was working and he was just another guest, no matter how powerful he seemed. But nothing about him felt like something I could categorize that easily. The air around us felt different, heavier, like the room itself had shifted its attention in our direction. I became aware of the silence first, not complete, but close enough that it felt deliberate. Conversations softened, laughter faded, and the subtle rhythm of the evening faltered as if everyone sensed something they could not quite name. Adrian did not look at them. He did not need to. His focus remained entirely on me, steady and unbroken. My heart was beating too fast now, each pulse echoing in my ears. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to hold on to something normal, something grounded. "I need to get back to work," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice even. It sounded smaller than I intended, like the room had swallowed part of it before it could fully form. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, not in anger, not in irritation, but in a way that felt like he was measuring something unseen. "Work can wait," he replied, just as softly. The words were simple, but they landed with more weight than they should have. My grip on the tray shifted slightly, my fingers brushing against the cold stem of a glass. For a moment, I considered arguing, insisting, stepping back anyway. But the instinct that had kept me safe for years told me something else. Do not escalate. Do not challenge. Not here. Not with him. A subtle movement in my peripheral vision caught my attention. Two men in dark suits had repositioned themselves nearby, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough to notice everything. They were not guests. They were watching. Not me. Him. And by extension me. My stomach tightened. I had seen security before at events like this, but this felt different. More intentional. More controlled. Adrian followed my gaze briefly, then returned his attention to me without a trace of concern. "You spilled something earlier," he said, his tone shifting just enough to sound almost conversational. I blinked, caught off guard by the sudden change. "It was nothing," I replied. "Just a few drops." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering that answer, though his expression gave nothing away. "It was not nothing," he said quietly. "That was when I noticed it. One of the glasses on my tray was not quite right. The liquid inside looked identical to the others, pale gold under the chandelier light, but something about the way it settled felt off. Too still. Too precise. A faint unease curled through me. I had not prepared these drinks. I had simply picked up the tray from the service counter and walked out. My breath slowed, but not in relief. In focus. "I do not understand," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Adrian's gaze flickered to the tray for a fraction of a second before returning to my face. "You do not need to," he said. "Not yet." His hand moved again, this time not to restrain, but to guide. With a smooth, controlled motion, he lifted the tray slightly, just enough to remove one glass from its place. His fingers wrapped around the stem with careful precision. He did not drink it. He did not even raise it. He simply held it there, as if confirming something only he could see. The room felt tighter now, the silence more pronounced. I could feel eyes on us, curious, cautious, waiting. Adrian lowered the glass back onto the tray, but not in its original position. He set it slightly apart from the others, a small distinction that suddenly felt very important. "Do not serve that one," he said, his voice calm, almost gentle. The instructions settled over me with a clarity that cut through the confusion. My pulse kicked again, sharper this time. "Why?" I asked before I could stop myself. For the first time since this began, something in his expression shifted. Not fully, not enough to read, but enough to feel. "Because someone here made a mistake," he said quietly, "and I intend to find out who." A chill moved through me, subtle but undeniable. The night that had started as just another shift was no longer something I could step out of. Without realizing it, I had crossed into something else entirely. And standing this close to him, with the entire room holding its breath, I understood one thing with absolute certainty. I was already part of it. The words settled between us like a quiet signal that something had already been set in motion, and I was only just beginning to understand my place in it. I stared at the glass he had separated, my mind trying to catch up with the implications I was not ready to fully face. "Someone here made a mistake," he had said, but the way he said it did not feel like speculation. It felt like certainty. My fingers tightened slightly around the tray again, but this time it was not from nerves. It was awareness, the kind that sharpened everything around you whether you wanted it to or not. The music resumed, soft at first, then louder, like the room was trying to convince itself nothing had changed. Conversations picked back up in fragments, careful, measured, as if people were choosing their words more cautiously now. But the attention had not fully left us. I could feel it lingering in glances that lasted a second too long, in pauses that did not quite belong in casual conversation, in the way no one stepped too close. Adrian did not move away. He remained exactly where he was, his presence steady, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world. I realized then that he was not reacting to the situation. He was controlling it. My throat felt dry, but I forced myself to speak anyway. "What do you want me to do?" I asked quietly. The question came out more direct than I expected, but I did not take it back. If I was already involved, I needed to understand how far it went. His gaze held mine for a moment, something unreadable passing through it. Then he gave the smallest nod, as if I had just confirmed something for him. "Stay close," he said. "Do not serve anyone until I say so." The simplicity of the instruction made it more serious, not less. I nodded before I could second-guess it. The tray suddenly felt less like part of my job and more like something I was responsible for protecting. Adrian reached into his jacket with a smooth motion and adjusted something I could not see. It was subtle, almost invisible, but the men nearby reacted instantly. One shifted position closer to the entrance. Another turned slightly toward the bar area, his posture tightening in a way that did not draw attention, but definitely changed something. I watched it all happen in silence, my pulse steady but alert now, like my body had accepted the shift before my thoughts had. This was not panic. It was something colder. Focused. "You are not afraid," Adrian said quietly, his voice low enough that it felt like it existed only between us. It was not a question. I hesitated, because the truth was complicated. I should have been afraid. Every part of this situation suggested I should be. But the feeling that settled in my chest was not fear. It was something sharper. I am paying attention, I replied instead. That earned a reaction, small but real. The corner of his mouth shifted just enough to suggest approval, or maybe interest. Good, he said. Keep doing that. A server passed nearby, slowing slightly when they saw me standing still. Their eyes flicked to Adrian, then back to me, confusion written clearly across their face. I knew what they saw. A waitress not moving. A man who did not belong to their world standing too close. A moment that did not fit the pattern of the evening. I turned slightly, angling the tray away from them without making it obvious. They moved on, but the look lingered in my mind. How many people had noticed something was off already? How many were pretending not to? Adrian's attention shifted briefly toward the bar, then to the far side of the room near the terrace doors. His gaze lingered there for a second longer than anywhere else. I followed it without thinking. The same two men from earlier stood near the edge of the crowd, their conversation quieter now, their posture tighter. One of them glanced in our direction, then quickly looked away. That was when I felt it again. That quiet, underlying tension. Not loud, not obvious, but growing. Adrian stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough to carry a different weight. When I tell you to move, you move immediately, he said. Do not hesitate. Do not ask questions. My breath caught slightly at the tone, not harsh, but absolute. I nodded again, slower this time, understanding that this was no longer just about a glass on a tray. This was about timing, about control, about something that was still unfolding around us. The room looked the same, but it did not feel the same anymore. And standing there, with his presence anchoring everything into place, I realized something I could not ignore. Whatever was about to happen next, I was not just a witness. I was already part of it. The room felt like it was holding its breath again, but this time it was quieter, more controlled, like the pause before something irreversible. I shifted my weight slightly, careful not to disturb the balance of the tray, every muscle tuned to the tension building beneath the surface. Adrian's presence beside me had not changed, but something about him had sharpened, like a line drawn more clearly in the dark. His gaze moved once more toward the terrace, then to the bar, then back to the crowd, mapping everything with silent precision. I followed the pattern without thinking, my own awareness stretching beyond what I was used to noticing. People moved the same way they always did at events like this, but now I saw the details. A man adjusting his cuff too often. A woman glancing toward the exits without reason. The two men near the terrace speaking less and watching more. It was subtle, but once seen, it could not be unseen. My grip on the tray steadied further, not from calm, but from purpose. I was no longer just carrying drinks. I was holding something that mattered. Adrian stepped half a pace closer, his voice low and measured. We are almost out of time, he said. The words landed differently than anything he had said before. Not a warning, a conclusion. My pulse rose, but it stayed controlled, like my body had learned the rhythm of this moment. What happens when time runs out? I asked, my voice quieter than before, but no less steady. His eyes shifted to mine, and for a second, something deeper surfaced beneath the control. Then it was gone. Then we move, he said, as if summoned by the words. One of the men in suits near the entrance lifted his hand slightly, barely noticeable to anyone not watching for it. Adrian's attention flicked to him, then back to me. Now, he said. The word was soft, but it carried an edge that cut through everything else. His hand moved to the tray, not to take it, but to guide it down just enough so it no longer blocked my movement. With his other hand, he reached for me. Not roughly, not suddenly, but with a certainty that made resistance feel irrelevant. Before I could process the motion, he had pulled me forward, closing the distance completely. My breath caught as the world shifted in a single, decisive moment. The tray was gone from my hands, taken by someone behind me, so smoothly I barely noticed. And then I was no longer standing where I had been. Adrian sat, and I was pulled with him, guided onto his lap as if it had always been the intended place for me to be. The movement was controlled, deliberate, impossible to mistake for anything casual. The room reacted instantly. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way everything stopped just enough to be felt. Conversations broke mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. eyes turned without turning, attention locking onto the center of the shift. I froze for a fraction of a second, my instincts colliding all at once. This was not part of any world I understood. This was not something that happened to people like me. His arms settled lightly but firmly around my waist, not restraining, but anchoring me in place. "Stay," he said quietly near my ear. The word was not forceful, but it left no room for interpretation. My heart pounded once, hard, then steadied again, faster but focused. I became aware of everything at once. The weight of his presence behind me, the stillness of the room around us, the way no one stepped closer, the way no one intervened. I should have pulled away. I should have stood up, created distance, reminded myself that I had a choice. But something in the moment told me that moving without understanding would only make things worse. Adrian's gaze lifted, scanning the room again, but this time from a different position, one where nothing could approach him without being seen. I realized then what he had done. This was not just control. This was positioning. From here, he could see everything. From here, nothing could reach me without going through him. My breath slowed as the realization settled in. This was not about humiliation. It was not about display. It was about protection, hidden inside something that looked like power. His hand shifted slightly, adjusting just enough to keep me steady. "Do not look at anyone directly," he murmured. "Just listen." I obeyed without thinking, my gaze lowering slightly, my senses sharpening in ways I had never experienced before. The room resumed its movement slowly, cautiously, like people were unsure how much they were allowed to react. But beneath that surface, something had changed permanently. And sitting there, caught between the world I knew and the one I had just been pulled into, I understood something with absolute clarity. I was exactly where he needed me to be. I kept my gaze lowered just enough to follow his instruction, but not so much that I lost awareness of what was happening around me. Every sound felt sharper now, each voice carrying a layer beneath the words, something cautious, something restrained. His arm remained steady around me, not tightening, not loosening, just there, a constant reminder that I was no longer standing on my own terms. I focused on breathing, slow and even, matching the rhythm of the room as it tried to recover from what had just happened. No one addressed it directly. No one acknowledged it out loud. But everyone had seen. I could feel it in the way conversations restarted too carefully, like actors picking up lines they almost forgot. A woman laughed too brightly at something that was not funny. A man cleared his throat before continuing a sentence he had clearly lost. The illusion of normal returned, but it felt thinner now, stretched over something real. Adrian did not look down at me. He did not need to. His attention remained outward, scanning, measuring, calculating. From this position, I could feel the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his shoulders adjusted when someone moved in a certain direction, the way his breathing changed when his focus narrowed. I began to understand what he meant when he said to listen. It was not just about words. It was about patterns, about what did not fit. To my left, someone stepped closer to the table, a man with a polite smile that did not reach his eyes. He greeted Adrian with practiced ease, his tone respectful, but there was a slight delay in his timing, just enough to stand out now that I was paying attention. Adrian acknowledged him with a brief nod, nothing more. The conversation was short, controlled, and ended before it could become anything else. The man moved on, but not before his gaze flicked toward me for half a second. Not curiosity, not interest. Assessment. I felt it like a quiet mark being placed. Adrian's hand shifted slightly at my waist, not tightening, but grounding, as if he had noticed the same thing. "Good," he murmured under his breath. "You are starting to see it." I did not respond, but my awareness sharpened further. Across the room, the two men near the terrace had separated. One remained near the edge of the crowd, blending in again, while the other moved slowly toward the bar. His steps were unhurried, almost casual, but there was intention behind them now that I knew how to look for it. My heartbeat picked up again, not from panic, but from anticipation. Something was about to happen. I could feel it in the way the space tightened, in the way even the music seemed to fade into the background of everything else. Adrian leaned slightly closer, his voice low enough that it barely disturbed the air. "When I stand, you move with me," he said. "Do not look back. Do not stop." I nodded once, slow and deliberate, committing the instruction to memory. The man at the bar reached for a glass, his hand steady, his expression unchanged. But there was something about the way he paused, just for a fraction of a second, that made everything inside me go still. Adrian noticed it too. I felt it in the way his body shifted, the subtle change in tension that ran through him like a signal. Now, he said quietly, in one smooth motion. He stood, lifting me with him as if the transition had already been planned down to the smallest detail. My feet touched the floor again, but his hand remained at my side, guiding, directing, keeping me exactly where he wanted me to be. We moved forward together, not quickly, not urgently, but with a purpose that cut through the room like a quiet current. People stepped aside without being asked. Space opened where there had been none. I kept my eyes forward, just as he had instructed, but my senses stretched outward, catching everything I could. The man at the bar turned slightly as we approached, his expression polite, neutral, unaware, or pretending to be. Adrian stopped just short of him, close enough to close the distance, far enough to control it. For a moment, no one spoke. The air between them felt charged, not with noise, but with something deeper, something measured and precise. Adrian's voice broke the silence, calm and steady. "I believe that belongs to me," he said, his gaze dropping briefly to the glass in the man's hand. The man hesitated, just for a second, and in that second, everything became clear. Not in detail, not in explanation, but in certainty. Adrian had not been guessing, and whatever mistake had been made earlier was no longer hidden. It was standing right in front of us. The hesitation lasted less than a second, but in that second, the entire room seemed to tilt in a way only I could feel. The man's fingers tightened slightly around the glass, not enough to draw attention, but enough to confirm everything Adrian had already seen. I stood beside him, still, aware of every breath, every shift in weight, every glance that tried too hard to look casual. Adrian did not repeat himself. He did not need to. His gaze remained steady, fixed on the glass, then on the man holding it, as if the outcome had already been decided. The man smiled, polite, controlled, the kind of smile practiced in rooms like this. "I believe there has been some confusion," he said smoothly, his voice even, unhurried. "This was handed to me moments ago." Adrian's expression did not change, but something in the space between them tightened further, like a line being drawn that could not be crossed twice. "Then let us remove the confusion," Adrian replied, his tone calm, almost conversational. His hand moved, not fast, not forceful, just precise, closing the distance between them and taking the glass with a certainty that made resistance impossible without becoming obvious. The man allowed it, his smile fading just slightly at the edges, enough for me to see the shift even if no one else did. Adrian held the glass for a moment, studying it, not for appearance, but for confirmation. Then he turned slightly, his attention shifting toward one of the men in suits who had been watching from a distance. A subtle nod passed between them, silent, understood. The man at the bar stepped back half a pace, creating space that had not been there before. The room responded without reacting, conversations continuing, but quieter now, more careful. I realized then how controlled this environment truly was. Nothing erupted, nothing escalated. Everything adjusted. Adrian set the glass down on the bar, not among the others, but slightly apart, marked without needing to be labeled. His gaze returned to the man, holding it for a fraction longer than necessary. "You should leave," he said, not as a threat, not as a suggestion, but as a conclusion already reached. The man's jaw tightened for a moment, then relaxed, the polite mask slipping back into place. "Of course," he said, inclining his head slightly. "Enjoy your evening." He turned and walked away, his steps measured, unhurried, but there was something in the way he moved that no longer felt entirely composed. Adrian watched him go for exactly 3 seconds, then shifted his attention back to the room as if nothing of importance had happened. But everything had changed. I stood beside him, my pulse steady but elevated, my awareness still stretched thin across every detail. "Is that it?" I asked quietly, unable to keep the question from forming. His gaze flicked to me, and for a moment, something softer passed through it, not warmth, but acknowledgement. "For now," he said. The answer did not reassure me. It did not need to, because I understood what he meant. This was not an ending. It was a pause. One of his men approached, stopping just within speaking distance, his posture respectful but alert. "It is being handled," he said quietly. Adrian gave a single nod, dismissing him without another word. The man stepped back, blending into the room once more as if he had never been there. I exhaled slowly, not realizing I had been holding my breath. The tension that had filled the space moments ago began to ease, but it did not disappear completely. It lingered, like a memory the room would not forget. Adrian turned slightly toward me, his hand still steady at my side, grounding, anchoring. "You followed instructions well," he said. It was not praise in the way I was used to hearing it. It was an assessment, a conclusion. I swallowed, unsure how to respond. I did not know what would have happened if I had not, I admitted. His gaze held mine for a second longer this time, more focused, more direct. "That is why you listened," he said. The simplicity of it settled deeper than I expected. Not because it explained everything, but because it did not need to. Around us, the room had returned to its illusion of normal. Music filled the air again. Laughter rose in careful waves. Glasses clinked as if nothing had interrupted the night. But I knew better now, and standing there beside him, I understood something that felt both grounding and dangerous at the same time. This was only the beginning. The music swelled again, filling the gaps left by tension, but it no longer sounded the same to me, like I had stepped behind a curtain and seen what the performance was hiding. I shifted slightly beside Adrian, aware that although the immediate threat had passed, nothing about the night had returned to what it was before. My body still felt tuned to something sharper. Every movement around me filtered through a new kind of awareness I could not turn off. Adrian did not move away. His hand remained steady at my side, not possessive, not gentle, simply certain. It was not about holding me there anymore. It was about making sure I stayed exactly where I needed to be. I glanced toward the bar again, just for a moment, and saw that the glass he had set aside was already gone. Not removed in a noticeable way, not taken with urgency, just gone, like it had never been there at all. The precision of it sent a quiet chill through me. Everything was handled without disruption, without noise, without leaving a trace. I looked back at him, trying to understand how much of this had been planned and how much had been instinct. "You knew before I did," I said quietly. It was not a question. His gaze flicked to me, then away again, scanning the room as if nothing we were saying required his full attention. "I knew enough," he replied. The answer was simple, but it carried layers I could not fully reach yet. I hesitated, then pushed a little further. "And now," I asked, "what happens now?" For a moment, he did not answer. His attention moved across the room again, slower this time, more deliberate, as if confirming that every piece was exactly where it needed to be. Then he exhaled quietly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly. "Now we see who tries again," he said. The words settled heavier than anything he had said before. Not because they were louder, but because of what they implied. This was not over. It had only been interrupted. A server approached cautiously, stopping just far enough to be respectful. Her eyes flicked between me and Adrian, confusion and concern barely hidden beneath her professional expression. "Do you need anything, sir?" she asked, her voice careful. Adrian did not look at her. Not dismissively, just without distraction. "No," he said calmly. "Continue your work." She nodded quickly and moved away, but I saw the way she glanced back once, trying to understand what she had just witnessed. I could not blame her. I was still trying to understand it myself. The difference was that I no longer felt like I could step away from it. Adrian shifted slightly, turning just enough to face me more directly. Up close, his expression was still controlled, but there was something else there now, something less distant. "You should not be here tonight," he said quietly. The statement landed differently this time, not as a warning, but as something closer to concern. I met his gaze, holding it longer than I would have before. "I am here," I replied. His eyes held mine for a moment, measuring, considering, as if weighing something that had not been decided yet. Then something in his expression settled, like a conclusion had been reached. "Then you stay close," he said. The words were familiar, but the meaning had shifted. Before, it had been instruction. Now it felt like something else. A decision that included me. A quiet claim, not spoken loudly, but understood all the same. I felt it in the way the space around us adjusted again, in the way his presence seemed to draw a boundary without needing to announce it. I nodded once, not because I had to, but because I understood the alternative was no longer simple. Across the room, the man who had left was no longer visible. The two men near the terrace had disappeared as well, replaced by others who blended seamlessly into the crowd. The night continued, elegant, controlled, untouched on the surface. But beneath it, something had shifted permanently. I could feel it in the way my own instincts no longer aligned with the version of the evening I had started with. I was not just serving drinks anymore. I was watching, listening, waiting. Adrian's hand moved slightly, not tightening, just adjusting, as if confirming I was still there. I did not pull away. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a room that pretended nothing had changed, I realized something that settled deep and steady in my chest. Whatever this was, whatever world I had just stepped into, it was not going to let me walk out of it the same way I came in. The room had settled into its rhythm again, but I could no longer unhear the silence beneath it, the kind that waited rather than rested. I stood beside Adrian, aware that time had stretched in a way that made every second feel deliberate. My body had not relaxed, even though nothing else had visibly changed. If anything, the stillness felt more dangerous now. It was too smooth, too controlled, like the night was correcting itself after something had nearly gone wrong. Adrian's presence remained constant, but there was a subtle shift in him I could not ignore. He was not just observing anymore. He was anticipating. His gaze moved less, but with more precision, as if he had narrowed the field to only what mattered. I followed without meaning to, my eyes tracing the same lines, searching for what did not belong. A man near the center of the room adjusted his tie for the third time in less than a minute. A woman near the stage glanced toward the entrance, then quickly looked away. A server paused longer than necessary before placing a drink on a table, then left too quickly. Each detail felt small on its own, but together, they formed a pattern that did not sit right. My pulse picked up again, not from fear, but from recognition. Something was building again. Adrian's hand shifted slightly at my side, just enough to draw my attention back to him. "Do not follow everything," he said quietly. "Choose what matters." I swallowed, nodding once, forcing myself to focus. Not every movement was important. Not every glance meant something. But some did. The challenge was knowing which ones. My eyes moved again, slower this time, more selective. That was when I saw him. Not the man from before. Someone else. He stood near the far end of the room, partially obscured by a group of guests, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. But his attention was not on the people around him. It was fixed, steady, directed toward Adrian. Not openly, not obviously, but enough for me to feel it. He had not been there earlier. I was sure of it. My breath slowed, my focus tightening. I did not point. I did not speak. But Adrian noticed the shift in me instantly. "What is it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. I tilted my head just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to guide his line of sight. "There," I murmured. His gaze followed the direction without hesitation. It took him less than a second to find the man. I felt it in the way his posture adjusted, in the way his breathing changed just enough to signal confirmation. He saw it too. "Good," he said quietly. "You are learning faster than expected." The words settled into me, not as praise, but as something closer to acknowledgement. The man across the room shifted slightly, as if sensing the attention, but he did not look away. Instead, he took a slow step to the side, blending deeper into the crowd, using movement as cover rather than escape. He was careful, deliberate. Adrian watched him for a moment, then turned his attention back to me. "Stay behind me if I move," he said. "Do not break pace." I nodded again, the instructions settling into place without resistance. My body was already responding before my mind fully caught up. The distance between us and the man was not large, but it felt significant, like crossing it would change something that could not be undone. Adrian stepped forward, his movement smooth, unhurried, but purposeful. I followed immediately, matching his pace, staying just behind him as instructed. The crowd adjusted again, parting slightly, creating space without understanding why. Conversations continued, but I could feel the shift in attention, the subtle awareness that something was happening again, even if no one could define it. The man moved once more, angling toward the side of the room, closer to the exit this time. Not running, not rushing, just repositioning. Adrian did not speed up. He did not call out. He simply adjusted his path, intercepting without making it obvious. It was like watching two lines slowly converge, neither one breaking the illusion of normal movement. My heartbeat echoed in my ears, steady but strong. This was different from before. More controlled. More precise. The man reached the edge of the crowd and paused, as if deciding his next move. Adrian closed the final distance with quiet certainty. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost polite. "You should not leave yet," he said. The man turned, his expression composed, but his eyes gave him away. Not fear. Not panic. Recognition. And in that moment, standing just behind Adrian, I understood something with absolute clarity. This was not coincidence. This was not random. Whoever this was, he had come here for a reason. And now, that reason had just been found. The recognition in the man's eyes did not fade, but it shifted, settling into something more controlled, like he had already calculated the next step before Adrian even spoke. I stood just behind Adrian, close enough to feel the subtle tension in his posture, the way his presence alone altered the space between them. The man offered a small, polite smile, the kind that belonged in a room like this, practiced and careful. "I was just leaving," he said, his tone even, as if nothing about this moment was unusual. Adrian did not move aside. He did not raise his voice. He simply held his position, and somehow, that was enough to stop everything else from continuing. "Not yet," Adrian replied calmly. The words were quiet, but they carried a finality that made the man's smile tighten at the edges. For a moment, neither of them moved. The room around us continued its performance, but I could feel the awareness gathering again, subtle but undeniable. People sensed it. They always did, even if they did not understand what they were sensing. The man glanced briefly to the side, not enough to be obvious, but enough for me to follow the movement. Another figure stood near the exit, partially obscured, watching. Not involved. Not yet. But connected. My pulse rose, sharper now, the pattern becoming clearer. This was not one mistake. This was layered. Adrian noticed it too. I felt it in the way his stance adjusted, just slightly, enough to block the man's path without making it look intentional. "You came here with a purpose," Adrian said, his voice still calm, still controlled. "I would like to hear it." The man exhaled softly, almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You give me too much credit," he replied. "I am just another guest." Adrian's gaze did not waver. "No," he said quietly. "You are not." The silence that followed was heavier than before, not because it was louder, but because it held something unresolved. The man's eyes flicked to me for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, I felt it again. Assessment. Calculation. He had not expected me to be here. I was not part of his plan. That realization settled into me with a clarity that made everything sharper. Adrian shifted slightly, just enough that I was no longer visible from the man's direct line of sight. The movement was subtle, but deliberate. "Stay behind me," he murmured, barely moving his lips. I did not hesitate. I adjusted my position instantly, my body aligning with his without thought. The man noticed the shift, even if he did not react to it openly. His attention returned fully to Adrian, his expression smoothing back into something controlled. "If there has been a misunderstanding, I am sure it can be resolved another time," he said. His tone was careful now, measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word with precision. Adrian tilted his head slightly, considering, but not agreeing. "There was no misunderstanding," he said. "Only timing." The words landed differently than the others. They were not directed only at the man in front of him. They were a statement about something larger, something still unfolding. The man's jaw tightened again, just for a second, before he forced it to relax. The figure near the exit shifted, stepping slightly closer, still not intervening, but no longer distant. The room felt smaller now, the edges closing in around this moment. Adrian's attention flicked to the movement, then back, as if confirming what he already knew. "You should stay for a while longer," he said calmly. "It would be unfortunate to miss what happens next." The man held his gaze, and for the first time, something real broke through the surface. Not fear, not panic, but awareness. He understood that leaving was no longer simple. He inclined his head slightly, a gesture that looked like agreement but felt like calculation. "Of course," he said. "I would not want to miss anything important." Adrian stepped back half a pace, just enough to release the immediate pressure without removing control. The man did not move past him. He did not leave. He stayed exactly where he was, caught in a space that no longer belonged to him. I remained behind Adrian, my senses still stretched thin, my mind piecing together fragments that refused to stay separate. This was not over. It was not even close. And as the room resumed its careful rhythm once more, I understood something with a certainty that settled deep in my chest. Whatever was about to happen next, it had already begun. The space around us did not loosen after that exchange. It tightened in a quieter way, like every person in the room had unconsciously adjusted their position without knowing why. I remained just behind Adrian, aware that the distance between us and the man had not changed, but the balance had. It was no longer a conversation. It was a pause between moves. Adrian did not speak again immediately. He let the silence exist, let it settle, let it do the work that words would have interrupted. The man held his ground, but there was a difference now. He was no longer in control of the space he occupied. I could see it in the way his shoulders held tension just beneath the surface, in the way his eyes tracked not just Adrian, but the room beyond him. He was calculating exits, options, outcomes. I felt it as clearly as if he had said it out loud. My own awareness stretched further, following his line of thought without meaning to. The figure near the exit had moved again, closer now, not intervening, but no longer pretending distance. Another presence, subtle, appeared near the opposite side of the room, blending into the crowd with practiced ease. They were not guests. They were watching. The pattern was closing. Adrian shifted his weight slightly, and I felt the change ripple outward. His hand brushed lightly against my arm, not holding, just confirming I was still exactly where he needed me to be. Stay steady, he murmured, his voice low enough to exist only between us. I nodded, even though he did not look back to see it. My breathing remained controlled, my body aligned with his pace, his stillness, his intent. The man exhaled slowly, then gave a small nod, as if accepting something he could not change. You have made your point, he said. His tone was even, but there was a quiet edge beneath it now, something that had not been there before. Adrian's gaze remained fixed, unwavering. I have not made it yet, he replied. The words landed heavier than anything before them. Not louder, not sharper, just final in a way that suggested something inevitable was approaching. The man's eyes flicked to me again, faster this time, less controlled. I felt the shift instantly. Not fear, not exactly, but urgency. He had not planned for me. I was still the variable he could not account for. Adrian noticed it too. I felt it in the way his stance adjusted, the subtle repositioning that placed me fully behind him, removing me from direct view without making it obvious. The room seemed to narrow further, the edges closing in around the three of us. The music continued, the conversations carried on, but everything felt distant now, like it existed on a different level I could no longer fully access. The man's hand moved slightly, not reaching for anything, just shifting, like he was testing the space around him. Adrian's response was immediate, not with movement, but with presence. The air itself seemed to press tighter, closing that space before it could be used. No sudden decisions, Adrian said quietly. You will not like how they end. The warning was calm, almost gentle, but it carried a certainty that left no room for misinterpretation. The man stilled completely. For the first time, the illusion cracked fully. His expression remained composed, but his eyes gave everything away. He understood, not just the situation, but the outcome if he miscalculated. A long second passed, then another. Finally, he gave a slow nod, accepting the boundary that had been drawn. Understood, he said. The word was simple, but it carried weight. Adrian held his gaze for one last moment, then stepped back just enough to release the pressure without removing control. The shift was subtle, but immediate. The room exhaled, though no one seemed aware they had been holding their breath. The man did not move away. He did not leave. He stayed, exactly where he was, contained within a space that was no longer his to control. Adrian turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge me again. It is done, he said quietly. But something in his tone told me that was not entirely true. Because as the room resumed its careful rhythm once more, I could still feel it beneath everything. That quiet, waiting tension. And I knew, without needing to ask, that whatever had been stopped tonight was only part of something much larger. The tension did not disappear when Adrian said it was done. It only shifted, becoming something quieter, more deliberate, like a door that had been closed but not locked. I stood behind him, still aware of every movement in the room, but something inside me had changed. The sharp edge of urgency had softened into something more complex, something that felt like understanding without full clarity. Adrian stepped slightly to the side, creating space that had not existed before, but not enough to fully separate us. The distance was intentional, measured, like everything else he did. "You can breathe now," he said quietly, his voice carrying less weight than before, but no less control. I let out a slow breath I had not realized I was holding, my shoulders easing just slightly. The room responded in kind, conversations growing louder, laughter returning with more confidence, as if the invisible pressure had lifted just enough to allow it. But I knew better. It had not lifted. It had simply moved. My eyes drifted across the crowd again, not searching this time, just observing. The man near the exit had stepped back into the shadows of the room, no longer trying to leave, no longer drawing attention. The one Adrian had confronted remained in place, speaking now with someone nearby, his expression composed, his posture controlled, but I could still see it. That subtle awareness. That quiet restraint. He was still inside something he could not step out of. Adrian followed my gaze briefly, then returned his attention to me. "You are still watching," he said. It was not a question. I nodded once, meeting his eyes. "I do not think I can stop now," I admitted. The truth came easily, more easily than I expected. He studied me for a moment, not judging, not dismissing, just observing in the same way he had observed everything else tonight. "Good," he said finally. "Most people never learn how to see what is right in front of them." The words settled into me, not as praise, but as something grounding. I had not planned for this. I had not chosen it, but I had adapted to it. A subtle shift in the room caught my attention again, not sharp enough to trigger alarm, but enough to notice. One of the men in suits approached Adrian, stopping just short of interrupting the space between us. "Everything is contained," he said quietly. Adrian gave a small nod, acknowledging without elaboration. "And the others?" he asked. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered. "Watching. Waiting." Adrian's gaze flicked briefly across the room again, then returned. "Of course they are," he said. The response carried no surprise, only confirmation. The man stepped back, disappearing into the flow of the evening as seamlessly as he had arrived. I shifted slightly, my awareness settling into something steadier now. "You expected more," I said quietly. It was not a challenge, just an observation. Adrian's expression changed just enough to suggest agreement. "I expect patterns," he replied. "When they break, it means something else is forming." The words lingered, heavier than they seemed. I thought about everything that had happened, the glass, the man at the bar, the second figure near the exit. It had not been random. None of it had. And if it was not random, then it was not finished. A quiet realization settled into me, deeper than before. This night was not an isolated moment. It was part of something ongoing, something that would continue whether I understood it or not. Adrian shifted his stance slightly, turning more fully toward me now. "You should go," he said. The words caught me off guard. Not because of what they meant, but because of how they were said. Not as an order, not as a dismissal, as a choice. I hesitated, my instinct pulling in two directions at once. The part of me that understood this world was not mine told me to leave. The part of me that had already stepped into it told me something else. "And if I do not?" I asked quietly. His gaze held mine, steady, unbroken. "Then you stay," he said. The simplicity of it settled everything. There was no pressure, no demand, just a line drawn clearly between two paths. I looked around the room one more time, taking in the polished surfaces, the carefully controlled smiles, the illusion of normal that had never quite returned to what it was before. Then I looked back at him. "I stayed," I said. The decision felt both small and irreversible. Adrian did not react immediately, but something in his expression shifted, subtle, almost imperceptible, like a piece falling into place. "Then stay close," he said quietly. This time, the words carried something more than instruction, something closer to promise. And standing there, no longer just part of the background, I understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. I had crossed a line tonight, and there was no stepping back from it. The decision settled into the space between us with a weight that felt far heavier than the single word it had taken to make it. I stayed. The room did not react, not openly, but something in the air shifted again, like the night itself had acknowledged the choice before anyone else could. Adrian did not move immediately. He held my gaze for a fraction longer, as if confirming that I understood what staying meant, not just now, but after tonight ended. Then he gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and turned his attention back to the room. The movement was subtle, but it changed everything. I was no longer standing behind him by instruction. I was there by choice. And that difference settled deep in my chest, steady and irreversible. The music swelled again, fuller this time, louder, as if the evening had decided to reclaim its rhythm. Guests moved more freely now, conversations gaining confidence, laughter returning without hesitation. On the surface, everything looked untouched, exactly as it had been when the night began. But I could still see it. The small adjustments, the careful glances, the invisible lines that had been drawn and redrawn without anyone naming them. Adrian shifted slightly, positioning himself so that I stood beside him rather than behind. It was a small change, but it carried meaning. "You will not be serving tonight," he said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded once, accepting it without resistance. My role had already changed. The tray, the uniform, the quiet invisibility I had relied on, none of it fit anymore. A server approached, hesitant, her expression uncertain. She looked at me, then at Adrian, then back again, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she understood. Adrian spoke before she could. "She is with me," he said. The words were simple, but they carried a clarity that left no room for confusion. The server nodded quickly and stepped away, her uncertainty replaced by something closer to understanding. Not full comprehension, but enough to stop questioning. I felt it then, more clearly than before. The shift in how the room saw me. Not as someone passing through, not as part of the background, but as something connected to him. The awareness settled over me slowly, but it did not feel heavy. It felt certain. Across the room, the man who had been stopped earlier remained where he was, his movements controlled, his expression neutral, but his attention never fully leaving us. The second figure near the exit had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone else who blended more seamlessly into the flow of the evening. The pattern had not ended. It had simply adapted. Adrian followed my gaze briefly, then looked back at me. "They will try again," he said. "Not tonight, but soon." The statement was not dramatic. It was not meant to alarm. It was simply true. I felt it settle into me without resistance. "Then I will be ready," I replied. The words came out steadier than I expected, but they felt right. Adrian studied me for a moment, his gaze more direct now, more focused. There was no surprise in his expression, only acknowledgement. "You already are," he said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than anything else he had said tonight, because it was not about what might happen next. It was about what had already changed. A subtle movement near the edge of the room caught my attention again, but this time, it did not pull me off balance. I saw it, noted it, let it pass. The difference was clear. I was no longer reacting. I was observing. The night continued around us, elegant, controlled, untouched on the surface. But beneath it, something had shifted permanently, not just in the room, but in me. Adrian stepped slightly closer, not enough to crowd, just enough to anchor. The gesture was quiet, almost unnoticeable, but it carried intention. "You crossed into something tonight," he said softly. The words were not a warning. They were a recognition. I met his gaze, holding it without hesitation. "I know," I replied. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was standing on the edge of something unknown. I felt like I was already inside it. Adrian's expression shifted, just slightly, something deeper settling into place. "Then stay," he said. The word was quiet, but it echoed far beyond the moment. Not an order, not a request, a statement of what was now inevitable. I did not look away. I did not step back. I stayed. And in that stillness, surrounded by a world that would never fully reveal itself, I understood something that felt both simple and impossible to undo. He could control the room without raising his voice. He could change the course of a night with a single decision. But standing there, within the space he had drawn around me, I realized the truth that mattered most. He did not pull me into his world by force. He made it impossible for me to want to leave.